Welcome to tonight's episode of History You Can Eat, where we sauté fact with folklore, sprinkle in jokes like cayenne, and serve it up family style. You know the outline. In 1803, the United States bought a massive chunk of land from France for $15 million, about 4 cents an acre, less than a latte per national park. But the inside of that story, it's as layered as a muffuletta. We're talking a space roughly 828,000 square miles, stretching from the Mississippi River up through the Great Plains and into the northern Rockies. A territory so large that when Lewis and Clark set out, the U.S. government basically told them, if you see anything nice, tag us. Tonight we're going to tour this place like it's a road trip in a time machine. Who lived there, what they believed, what they ate, who danced with whom, what laws they followed, why Napoleon said, take it. And what happens in the alternate universe where Napoleon kept it and posted selfies from St. Louis in a bicorn hat. Grab your water bottle. The Mississippi is long. What was Louisiana anyway? Louisiana, in 1803, wasn't just the future state of Louisiana. It was a rectangle that looked like an early drawing of the U.S. on a napkin, everything west of the Mississippi and east of the Rockies, north to Canada. Parts of present-day Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, west of the Mississippi, North and South Dakota, Nebraska, most of Kansas and Oklahoma, slices of Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. Imagine you ordered a small baguette and got a baguette the size of a school bus. French colonizers had originally claimed it in the 1600s, named it for King Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King, who would have loved a territory so big it needed its own sunscreen. Spain held it from 1762, then secretly handed it back to France in 1800, Treaty of San Ildefonso. By the time Napoleon looked at the map, Haiti had staged the most successful slave revolution in the hemisphere. British ships were prowling, and France's imperial to-do list looked like this. Number 1. Conquer Europe. Number 2. Try not to get yellow fever. Number 3. Sell Louisiana, probably. If you've ever been told the land was empty, that's like calling a jazz club silent while the sax player takes a breath. The Louisiana Territory throbbed with nations. Osage in the lower Missouri and Arkansas regions. Masters of diplomacy and trade. Osage caravans moved like Amazon Prime on moccasins. They negotiated horses from the plains and goods from the Mississippi. Mandan and Hidatsa along the upper Missouri. Sedentary agriculturalists in earth-lodged towns. They farmed corn, beans, squash, and ran trading networks thick as a family group chat. Their towns were so prosperous that when Lewis and Clark stayed the winter, from 1804 to 1805, near present-day North Dakota, they were basically house-sitting the coolest compound on the river. The Arikara, otherwise known as Sainish, further downstream, were traders and farmers who knew the river like Netflix knows your taste. The Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota across the plains. Horse cultures with mobile power. If the river was a highway, the bison was the semi-truck, and these were the best drivers in North America. The Pawnee, Oto-Missouri, the Kansa, Ponca, Omaha, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Blackfeet, Crow, Comanche on the southern and western edges, each with different economies. Had crop fields along river bottoms, teepee camps following bison, mountain traders harvesting obsidian gossip and real obsidian. Caddo and Quapaw in the lower Mississippi/Arkansas region. Towns, mound heritage, diplomacy as craft. And on the Gulf and lower Mississippi, Choctaw and Chickasaw communities interconnected with French, Spanish, and later American trade webs. Here is a little-known gem for everyone. In the 1700s, French métis, which were mixed French native families, created kinship networks that stitched river posts into cooperative neighborhoods. Your cousin wasn't just family. Your cousin was a customs union. If the modern state of Louisiana feels legally different, that's because it is. The French and Spanish introduced civil law traditions, think code-based, text-heavy rules, rather than the English common law of precedent. Even after the purchase, many parishes, or counties, kept the habit of notaries recording just about everything. Want to know who bought a mule in 1797 and how shiny it was? There's a notarial act for that. Lesser known, the region hosted Islenos, better known as Canary Islanders, who came during Spanish rule to the lower Mississippi. Germans along the German coast, parish names like St. Charles, St. John come from them. Acadian refugees, later Cajuns, who arrived after the British expelled them from Nova Scotia. Free people of color who developed property, schools, and mutual aid societies, and maroon communities. Self-liberated black people living in swamps and bayous, practicing agriculture, fishing, and guerrilla survival. The frontier wasn't a melting pot, it was more of a gumbo, distinct ingredients sharing a roux. Let's get into the customs of the Louisiana Territory, from bison to beignet. On the plains, dried pemmican, bison, fat, berries, functioned as a protein bar with better branding. Downriver came okra, rice, sugar, file or sassafras, and spice trades through New Orleans. Creole cooks mixed West African technique, French sauces, and indigenous plants. If taste buds had passports, they were stamped to capacity. Dance and music. Fiddles at French posts, drums and powwows on the plains, work songs along the levees, and Catholic processions in the city. Sundays in New Orleans Congo Square, legal gatherings where enslaved and free black people drummed, danced, traded, left deep imprints on American music. Imagine the blues, jazz, and everything that grew from them as the Mississippi's echo. We must also touch on the design of the region's shelter. Earth lodges up north showed thermal genius. Shotgun houses and raised cottages near the Gulf acted as humidity negotiators. River life demanded porches. Prairie life demanded mobility. Mountain life demanded walls thick enough to gossip with winter. Why the Louisiana Territory mattered to the U.S., besides the fact that West is big. Control of the Mississippi was the game. Whoever owned New Orleans could tax the continent's groceries. The Ohio Valley farmers, your corn-to-whiskey startups, needed the river to export. If France held the river, the young United States was going to have to knock politely. Or not. After the purchase. The Lewis and Clark expedition from 1804 to 1806 mapped routes, gathered scientific data, and, let's be honest, dropped a lot of pins on indigenous land without permission. But their journals became America's first big national travel blog. The fur trade boomed, St. Louis, St. Joseph, and up the Missouri to Fort Union, with Metis and native trappers doing the bulk of the work and risk. Your winter coat? Sponsored by Beaver's Bad Luck. The river system became America's freight elevator. Cotton, sugar, timber, later wheat and cattle. Steamboats turned river towns into boom towns, and into floating boiler explosions. Nothing says 19th century like a steamboat accident followed by an optimistic brass band. Politically, the purchase fed the great national argument. Would new territories be free or slave? Say hello to the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The Louisiana Territory is basically the hidden boss battle in the storyline that leads to the Civil War. Culturally, the purchase redistributed sovereignty away from native nations, whose treaties were negotiated, moved, or broken to serve settlement. That's not punchline material. It's the sobering footnote under every celebration of cheap land. Napoleon dreamed big. He wanted to re-establish France as a Western Hemisphere powerhouse. Sugar Islands, Haiti, Guadeloupe, mainland grain and livestock in Louisiana feeding those islands, and a transatlantic empire like a croissant wrapped around the Atlantic. Then reality swung a frying pan. Haitian Revolution, which took place from 1791 to 1804, led by Toussaint Louverture and later Jean-Jacques Dessalines. The French expedition under Charles Leclerc collapsed under fierce resistance and yellow fever. If Haiti is the domino, Napoleon's empire is the slinky that didn't bounce back. Britain's Royal Navy. If France tried to reinforce Louisiana, the fleet might turn the Gulf of Mexico into the world's largest French disappointment. France needed cash for European wars. America had a checkbook and anxiety about river access. So Napoleon said, in essence, if I can't eat the cake, I'll sell the bakery. Less told tidbit, even after the sale, Spanish officials in parts of the territory were like, we just worked here. Who's the boss now? The transfer took time, paperwork, and a lot of per my last treaty energy. The Osage were so economically central that U.S. officials sometimes described diplomacy with them as the key to the entire lower Missouri. Think of the Osage as the customs office with a great horse program. German coast farmers near New Orleans pioneered irrigation and levee know-how that quietly undergirded sugar's rise. Your dessert owes them hazard pay. Free black mutual aid societies in the lower Mississippi created loan funds, burial insurance, and schools, prefiguring later civil rights infrastructure. Caddo pottery traditions spread design motifs across trade routes. Archaeologists still track these like ancient emojis. Some French dialects of Upper Louisiana shared features with Canadian French, while Creole, a separate language, mixed French lexicon with West African grammar. Proof that the territory's culture was not a monochrome, but a tie-dye. But suppose they did keep it and stabilize it, what then? They might encourage more French immigration west of the Mississippi. St. Louis becomes Saint Lumiere, home of the world's first croissant-smothered hot dish. Solidify civil law and French notarial culture across the plains. American settlers crossing from Kentucky would suddenly need translators and a thicker wallet for stamped paperwork. Create a native diplomacy map quite different from U.S. expansion. France historically relied heavily on alliances and trade rather than mass settlement. Some tribes might prefer the French system to the relentless land market of the U.S., though pressures for land would still grow, especially with cotton, sugar, and later wheat. Force the U.S. to develop alternative western corridors. Stronger push into Florida early, heavier settlement along the Atlantic seaboard and Great Lakes, and maybe a Pacific grab via Spanish California sooner than 1840s. Picture New Yorkers in 1825 saying, "You know what's nice? San Diego." The real twist: slavery. A French Louisiana would still run on plantation economics in the South unless France abolished slavery earlier across its empire, which it did in 1794, then Napoleon reinstated in 1802, then abolished again in 1848. If French Louisiana followed abolition in 1848, the lower Mississippi could become a magnet for freedom seekers decades earlier than the U.S. Civil War, rewriting African American history west of the river. Maybe Napoleon sells it not to a country, but to a consortium that becomes a sovereign republic. Call it the Commonwealth of Louisiana. What does it look like? A bilingual, trilingual, really, republic. French and English would serve as administrative languages, with Spanish recognized regionally and indigenous languages protected. Sessions of Parliament begin with, "Bonjour, y'all." Civil Code Foundation with elected parishes and strong notarial registries. Land, water rights, and mineral claims recorded like grandma's recipes, meticulously, with flour on the page. Indigenous compacts. The state recognizes treaty zones for Osage, Mandan-Hidatsa-Arikara, Lakota, Pawnee, Caddo, Quapaw, Choctaw, etc., with revenue sharing on river trade and resources. The Missouri River becomes a joint-managed corridor. Enforcement is uneven because politics, but way better than in our timeline. The economy. Port of New Orleans becomes the Zurich of the Mississippi. Tariffs fund schools and levees. Levees protect tariffs and schools, a virtuous circle with good gumbo. Up the river, St. Louis, Omaha, Bismarck, Kansas City, on the border, evolve as inland free ports with bonded warehouses. Fur trade morphs into beef, then into rail hubs, then into agritech. Sugar and rice in the south, wheat and cattle in the plains, timber and later oil and gas in the south-central zones. By 1900 the Republic is the breadbasket broker between Canada and the U.S. The currency. The pelican, because of course. It stubbornly holds a gold standard until a flood knocks sense into Parliament. What might military and diplomacy look like under a hypothetical unnexed Louisiana Territory? A riverine coast guard called the Garde du Fleuve, with shallow draft boats and enough brass bands to stop a war just by parading. Neutrality pacts with the U.S. and Britain. Customs union with Mexico for Gulf trade. When Europe quarrels, Louisiana sends rice and a letter. We hope you work it out. We're very busy with the harvest. Cajun and Creole cultures flourish in the South with official support for French immersion schools. Plains powwows integrate into national festivals. The Osage host an annual diplomacy fair where senators come to get politely out-negotiated. Architecture mixes shotgun houses with courtyard townhouses, Earth Lodge-inspired museums in the north, and a capital that looks like a wedding cake married a riverboat. National sport? A river version of soccer called ballet K played on floating pitches, refereed by pelicans. Okay, not the last part, but let's keep the pelicans. Tough parts. Managing a multi-nation republic across floodplains and blizzards is hard. Slavery's legacy would still haunt the South. Emancipation could arrive with French timing, maybe sometime around 1848, or via internal reform, either way requiring massive land and voting rights settlements. In the 20th century, the Republic rides booms, oil, grain exports, and busts, floods, droughts, commodity crashes. But its greatest asset remains the river network, the original broadband. Would it survive? Likely, yes, wedged between the US and Canada, too useful to invade, too charming to ignore, too busy exporting rice to listen to your arguments. Why the real purchase changed the United States. Back in our timeline, the Louisiana Purchase was like installing an expansion pack called Manifest Destiny, beta release. It gave the U.S. the hydrological skeleton, the Mississippi-Missouri system, to move people, crops, and ideas. Shifted the global center of grain from Old World valleys to the American heartland. Supercharged the steamboat era, railroad grids, cattle drives, prairie homesteads, and later, aviation routes. Fueled debates over slavery, statehood, and federal power that shaped the Constitution's lived meaning. Created the stage on which Indigenous removal would be brutally enacted, an indelible cost that any honest celebration must name. And culturally, the territory braided together French civil law, Spanish administration, Anglo markets, African diasporic culture, and indigenous knowledge of land and waters. The result is the soundtrack of America, from spirituals to jazz to Zydeco, and the pantry of America. From jambalaya to cornbread to barbecue migrating north on rail cars. Conclusion. Laughing with a mouth full of history. So what is the Louisiana Territory's legacy? It's a reminder that history isn't just presidents signing papers. It's rivers moving people. It's not just Napoleon cashing out. It's Osage diplomats, Mandan horticulturists, Cajun fiddlers, Creole educators, German irrigators, Isleno fishermen, free black mutual aid organizers, and plains riders reading the sky like scripture. The territory was not a void that became America. It was a world that the United States joined, changed, and was changed by. And because this is a comedy set, let's end with the question that always gets the crowd thinking between laughs. What if France had kept Louisiana? Maybe the U.S. would still have gotten its West, just with more paperwork and croissants. Maybe emancipation along the lower Mississippi arrives in 1848 under a French flag, reshaping the Civil War. Maybe Lewis and Clark become travel vloggers denied visas. Today's episode, we made it to the line and the customs officer said, "Non." Maybe that independent Republic of Louisiana exists, where school kids pledge allegiance to the pelican, and the national anthem is a fiddle tune with a powwow break and a second-line outro. But here's the real punchline. Regardless of flag, the river wins. It ties together mountains and marshes, wheat and jazz, bison trails and container ships. The Mississippi doesn't argue politics. It just keeps rolling, carrying stories from north to south, from yesterday to tomorrow. So next time you see the Louisiana Purchase shaded in on a map, don't just think, cheap land. Think, a continent opening a door, 100 nations in conversation, an empire selling its future, a young republic bargaining for its identity, and a river smiling like, took you long enough. Now, because every set needs a callback, here's yours. The United States bought Louisiana for 4 cents an acre. 4. In modern terms, that's like getting a full streaming service, forever, for the price of one shared password. Except instead of movies, you got national destiny, several future states, 10,000 barbecue recipes, and a permanent debate about who we are and who we owe.